Are you going to start, Ann? No?
You're set to do that, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, do it.
Okay, you ready, Carol?
Yes.
Now I see one chat on here and I don't have any questions. Okay, well, welcome to the Marin History Museum's lecture series being presented on Zoom this evening. I'm Marcy, volunteer coordinator for programs. I want to welcome all of you. We really appreciate your supporting us in these little Zoom history talks. And if you, and we hope to continue doing Zoom into the next year while we are respecting the COVID precautions that we find ourselves all necessary to pay attention to. So we'll probably continue to go this way. And if you'd like to support the museum and these future lectures, please go to our website at marinhistory.org, click on the donate button, and you could contribute to help us continue to carry these on. Little Zoom business before I start the introduction is that if you have questions during the talk, you could go to the chat button, click on that, type in your question, and then myself and Brian will see the questions and we can get those answered for you. I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Brian Crawford. He's a pretty good friend of mine. He's a historian and author of Marin County history, and he probably reaches out a little bit into the South Pacific and other places he's traveled and maybe wishes he was back to. Volunteers as a researcher and archivist at the map annex of the Marin County Free Library, the California Room. That's a good site to check out if you're looking for some history. And the Marin History Museum is especially grateful to Brian tonight for his work that he did on this project and for presenting it here tonight. Brian will describe the process that brought the 1852 story of the Verdenal family on their way from Missouri to California. And here I want to present Brian Crawford.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? If there's any technical problems, now's the time. All right. You're going to see me very little here. I'm just going to get this started, and then I want to share a PowerPoint presentation with you. So as Marcy said, my name is Brian Crawford. I live in San Anselmo and I'm very interested in local history. I work as a volunteer writer and researcher for both the California Room and the Marin History Museum. And tonight I wanted to tell you about the Marin History Museum's latest project, a brand new book. It's called Journal Across the Plains, 1852. I wanted to tell you how this book came about. It's quite a story. So give me just a minute to share my presentation with you. Is everybody seeing that? Okay. So if you've heard of me, it's probably because of my books and lectures on local history, including the history of the Bolinas-Fairfax Road and shipwrecks of Marin. Early in 2019, I was invited to participate in an exciting project working with the Marin History Museum staff and volunteers. In December 2001, Dolly and Ken McDonald of Kentfield contacted the museum to donate some items that had been handed down to Dolly from her great-grandfather, John Verdenal. Among the items they wished to donate were John's mother's French passport, her parents' 1839 marriage certificate, some family photographs, and letters. Even more remarkable was an elaborate child's bed frame, a battered hand-inscribed tin box, and a rather worn, thin, handwritten journal. Family lore said these items had come across the country in a covered wagon. Needless to say, the museum gratefully accepted the McDonald's donations, the journal was wrapped in acid-free wrappings, placed in an archival box, and put in a safe deposit box. For nearly 2 decades, the journal remained unread. 2 years ago, collection manager Heather Powell came across the old journal and started to turn the fragile pages. It was entitled Journal Across the Plains, John M. Verdenal. She was astounded by what she read. It had been written by 12-year-old John Martin Verdenal and his 10-year-old brother, Dominique Francois Verdenal. The handwriting was clear and legible. In plain language, the boys recounted their day-to-day adventures in a wagon train from St. Louis to Placerville over 5.5 arduous months in 1852. They endured hailstorms, Indian encounters, a murder and a hanging, and great privations in crossing the plains, the deserts of Nevada, and the snowy passes of the Sierra Nevada. Heather brought the journal to her colleagues. "Look at this," she whispered to the volunteers, cataloging books and scanning photographs. "Look at this," she repeated. Volunteers and museum employees quickly determined that 160 years was long enough, too long, for John and Dominique's reflections on their journey to remain hidden in obscurity. They drafted a proposal to expand the journal into a book with additional information about the family, those they met on the trail, and what became of them after their arrival in California. Board member Ann Batman took the proposal to the museum board and reported back to the team that the full board had accepted the proposal. Joe Haraff became the senior editor. Heather explored options for digitizing the 85-page diary, but the book was extremely fragile. Its binding could not withstand flattening on the museum's traditional scanner. A bit of research into the world of book scanning indicated that an overhead scanner with a V-shaped cradle would support the fragile journal best, but pricing was an immediate obstacle. On a whim, Heather contacted San Francisco-based Internet Archive, an organization she remembered from her days as a public library book cataloger. Internet Archive's mission is to provide universal access to all knowledge by building the world's most comprehensive online library of archived internet sites, books, and other cultural artifacts in digital form. Heather put in a call to headquarters and the appointment was made. The best part? It would be free. On digitization day, Heather transported the journal, nestled safely in its box, from the museum's collections facility in Marin County to the Richmond district of San Francisco. Through the building's columned entrance and into the marbled foyer, Heather handed the journal to Internet Archive staff for its lunchtime date and waited in a nearby cafe. Within 2 hours, the process was complete. Pages photographed, files created, upload finished. The first-hand accounts of the brothers Verdenal were now circulating electronically throughout the world among millions of other texts. While Heather turned paper into digital images, Joe began the long process of inputting the diary into Microsoft Word for editing. Fortunately, in 1929, some unlucky graduate student transcribed the journal into a 47-page typed document at the request of Dr. Herbert Bolton, chair of the history department at UC Berkeley and founding director of the Bancroft Library. The unknown transcriber's work saved the museum much effort. Unfortunately, their transcriptions were understandably suspect given the original author's penmanship, as well as their 19th century casual punctuation and capitalization. In this example, we were fairly certain that the rain had not recommended. A close reading of the original confirmed that the rain had recommenced. Both settled on Microsoft Word's embedded dictation skill. Enunciating with great clarity, she read the 1929 transcription into Word. Generally, the process went smoothly. The ability to instruct Word to recognize new line, new paragraph, and capitalize that was a great help. While you can insert periods and commas simply by naming them, the boys were parsimonious in their use of punctuation. Occasionally, Word didn't understand Joe's painfully robotic speech, leading to some delightful malaprops. A team favorite included when the transcription said, "Father killed 4 stagehands." We changed it back to the original, "Father killed 4 sage hens." Theater workers beware. There was much discussion as to how much or how little we could change the boys' work. After many iterations, our final decision was to clean up the punctuation a little for readability, but to leave the spelling, grammar, and formatting intact where possible. This would retain the 19th century flavor of the original. When Joe and Heather completed their work, they handed the most current version to me for my review and comments. I went through the transcription and compared it to the digital image of the boys' original journal, verifying it word for word. I found only a few errors, which I corrected. There were a number of lacunae where the original transcriber could not make out some words in the journal. I had some advantages because I had a digital version. By enlarging the journal image and manipulating light and contrast, I was able to identify most of these missing words and phrases. I also Googled all the people and places the boys mentioned and added explanatory footnotes, producing a much more complete and extensive annotated transcription. Finally, Larry A. Paul, a professional editor, volunteered to read the contemporary parts of the book for errors and confusion. Speaking of confusion, Larry also mistakenly edited the entire journal itself, which required an ocean of digital red ink. We still wince to think of Larry's extra effort. Finally, the full book's text was ready. The next step was to produce maps to illustrate the 2,500-mile route of the wagon train. That task was assigned to me. I thought it would be relatively simple. True, the boys only rarely named the places they camped, if they even had names, but they were good at recording their daily mileages. I thought it would be a simple matter of finding a map of the California Trail and marking their progress along it. Alas, it was not so simple. Though the route is roughly followed by Interstate 80, the Verdenals did not simply get on at the on-ramp in St. Louis and take the Placerville exit. The California-Oregon Trail, they're the same for 1,000 miles, is not a single route. There never was an official trail. People made cutoffs and bypassed difficult spots, so the route moved from season to season. High water closed some river crossings. Sometimes there were trails on both sides of a river and they could choose which to follow. The most used route one year might be very different from the popular route the next year. Over the years of its use, a number of major alternate routes called cutoffs were developed that might send the immigrants to a whole different part of the country entirely. Each wagon train had to decide for itself which route to take based on weather, season, supplies, and relations with the local Indians. Each time they met experienced travelers, they sought information as to the best routes that year. The Verdenal brothers were annoyingly remiss about recording these decisions. After all, they were young boys and probably not involved in the tactical discussions around the campfires. For all these reasons, tracing their route became very complex. When they mentioned a named place as fort or a trading post, a geological formation, or a place whose name and location are still known, I could put a fixed point and a date on the map. I bought books on the California-Oregon Trail, wrote to local historical societies, scanned old newspapers, and read the journals of other immigrants who did the route that same year. The Oregon-California Trail Association was very helpful. From these clues, I eventually determined which routes they had followed and could plot them on Google Earth. The next step was to try to locate all their camps. Their starting location was easy to determine. The ferry terminals and steamer docks where immigrants gathered for the journey were almost directly under the iconic Gateway Arch, built in 1965 to memorialize the westward expansion. This is where the Verdenals started. Their journey took 170 days, but on 18 of those days, they laid over to rest, forage, or hunt, so they actually camped 152 times. Since I had known locations every week or 10 days, it should just be a matter of measuring out their recorded mileages every day and marking the camps along the route. Again, it wasn't that simple. Covered wagons don't have odometers. It was natural enough to overestimate when the weather was bad or the road difficult and unpleasant. But even in the relatively easy early days of the journey, they greatly overestimated the distances. However, their errors were fairly consistent. I was able to apply the same percentage to each day's journey and arrive at the next known points with reasonable accuracy. A month into their journey, however, they left the United States at Kansas City and entered Indian territory. There were no more towns or named places. When they reached a fort or trading post, or they mentioned passing a feature, Independence Rock, Chimney Rock, etc., I could place a fixed point and recalibrate the distances. The result of all this research, hold on a sec. The result of all this research was a string of 152 dots on Google Earth, connected by a line. Even zoomed in, it was difficult to read and confused by modern place names. How to present this information clearly in a book? The editing team decided to hire a professional cartographer to create the maps. We found a freelancer, Mary Rostad, at Upwork.com, who seemed to have the skills we needed. In consultation with Mary, we decided that we needed one overall map to show the entire journey across the continent, plus 3 larger scale maps to show the details. Even these detailed maps would be packed with campsites, so we chose to mark only 1 camp a week. This seemed to provide the reader with the information they needed to place the journey in perspective without overwhelming with too much information. We all felt Mary had produced just the maps we wanted for our book. Now we needed illustrations. The museum's own collection was our first stop for illustrations. Collection manager Heather Powell traveled to local cemeteries to memorialize gravestones. She photographed Verdenal family artifacts. When we discovered family portraits in Philadelphia, Heather arranged for a local professional to take museum quality photographs. The whole team worked tirelessly to find just the right graphics to illustrate the boy's journey. Heather Powell was especially indefatigable in scouring the internet and reaching out to universities and libraries for assistance and permissions. Through Ancestry.com, we contacted some of John and Dominique's descendants. We added this biographical information to the book, along with family notes, extended notes on it. Now, with all the book's contents assembled, it was time to turn it into a book. The museum decided to pursue Fonthill Media as our publisher based on an existing relationship. Fortunately, after a few rounds of edits, Fonthill accepted our proposal and our contract was signed in July 2019 with a delivery date of March 31st, 2020 for the book's text and illustrations. The pandemic delayed the project, but dedicated staff at the museum and at Fonthill pushed on with Zoom meetings and emails. By July 2020, we received a draft of the book's cover and content for our final edits. 5 sets of eyes studied every word, comma, and reference. We were astonished how, after months of study, we still found bits to tweak. Changes noted, the truly final version was returned to be paged, a new term we learned which means to transform the text from Word into final layout, including illustrations. We then worked with web designer Carol Gordon to create a detailed website to promote the book. Again, working remotely, the editorial team worked with Carol to develop a website that included the maps, family trees, and the process we went through to produce this book. So that's how the book was created. Now let's hear from John and Dominique Verdenal themselves. The first entry in the journal is Journal of John and Dominique Verdenal from St. Louis, Missouri to Placerville, California by land. We started from St. Louis, Missouri on Monday, April 26, 1852 in the train of P.H. Ellsworth for California. The train was called the El Dorado train. It consisted of 13 wagons. Each wagon was numbered, ours was number 4, and about 75 persons, about 200 head of cattle and 15 horses. Our provisions were as follows: bacon in any quantity, about 12 hams, dried apples, beans of flour, about enough till Salt Lake City, cornmeal, plenty of pilot bread, coffee, tea, sugar, salt, rice, and pepper. P.H. Ellsworth, the owner and proprietor of the train, was an American and had been to California once before across the plains. He had a tyrannical disposition, as the sequel will show. He advertised in the press 3 months before departing that the train was in readiness at any time. The price for passage fixed by him was $100 per person through to California. He received this money from 75 persons about 6 weeks before starting, and then he hastily collected his train and thus established himself without capital. But to proceed, there were 8 families in the train. There were about 75 persons, as stated, out of which there were 10 ladies, 5 boys and girls, and the rest were men. The wagons were of a rather small size and were each covered with an awning. Now, this per person fee of $100 is equivalent to about $3,400 today. So for John and Francois Verdenal and their 2 boys, the fare was almost $14,000, a significant outlay for a poor farming family. 2 weeks later, The El Dorado train had reached the end of the United States. Monday 10th, started at 7 o'clock and at noon arrived at Jefferson City, the capital of the state of Missouri. Stopped the balance of the day at the city. We visited the State House, a fine building where the legislature meets. We also visited the state penitentiary, where we seen prisoners of all hues, from the pickpocket to the vilest murderer. This prison is surrounded by high walls of stone. Every prisoner labors, and all kinds of articles are manufactured here. The city, owing to its high and hilly position, has made but little progress. Came this day 4 miles. After 2.5 months of plodding across the prairie along the Platte River, they finally reached the famous Fort Bridger in what is now Wyoming at the end of July. Saturday 31st, started at 6, passed several shallow streams during the day, and arrived at Fort Bridger, 112 miles from Salt Lake City. The fort is comprised of 3 log houses. We saw Bridger, the old mountaineer. He inhabited this place for 30 years, came 20 miles, camped at the fort, grass in abundance. Jim Bridger was among a party of trappers who found South Pass, the only practical route over the Rocky Mountains. He also discovered the Great Salt Lake and was among the first to ever see Yellowstone. 9 days later, the Verdenals saw their first signs of civilization, the 5-year-old town of Salt Lake City. Monday 9th, left our old camping ground at 6, went on, and soon were in sight of the city of the Great Salt Lake. At 2 o'clock, we reached it. The city is squarely built. The streets are very broad and run at right angles. The houses present a neat appearance. They are mostly built of adobe and then painted white. Each block in the city in the average does not contain more than 3 houses. The balance is all farmed and used to raise animals such as cattle, poultry, etc. One of the finest buildings is Brigham Young's, the governor's residence. The State House is also a fine edifice. Ellsworth bought 1,000 pounds of flour for the train, about 80 pounds for each wagon. Saw one of the Mormon temples. The city is situated in a large valley in which the Great Salt Lake lies embosomed. In the lake is a large mountain, and the whole valley around is surrounded by mountains. Wood is scarce and can only be got but from the mountains. The valley is covered with verdure, and the climate throughout is one of the finest in the world. The authorities prohibit the use of liquor and smoking or chewing tobacco. They also discountenance swearing and profane language. They went so far as to attempt to arrest one of our men in this act. Went on and passed several hot springs and camped on a cold one. Came 20 miles. Finally, after 5.5 months and almost 2,500 miles of nearly continuous traveling, the few remaining wagons of the El Dorado wagon train reached Placerville. Tuesday, October 12th, 1852, arrived at Placerville. Here I worked about 3 weeks at mining. My partner was Collins. We got along very well with each other. It was with much sorrow I parted from him on leaving Placerville for San Francisco about the 1st of November, 1852. So remember, when you think of this man out there working, he was 12 years old, working with all these miners. So the Verdenal family had finally reached their destination, the fabled land of California. They settled in San Francisco and in San Rafael. Both boys went to Harvard and got law degrees. John practiced law in San Francisco, while Dominique became a newspaper journalist in New York. They both married, raised families, and left many living descendants. The 2 young boys in the covered wagon truly found their promised land in California. If you'd like to read their entire journal and learn more about their adventures, their route, and their families, the new book can be purchased through the Marin History Museum website. Simply click the purchase button. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, we can check the chat.
Brian, that was fascinating. You guys did so much work. I love the the work it takes to put a story back together. To, you know, we can all fictionalize something, but when you try to put it together to back the way it probably was, it makes it difficult to do that task. And you did a great job. You know, I always tell the story that the famous historian Jeff Kramer always tells me, Marcy, it wasn't like this then. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to try to picture that. You know, another great story that was done about 7 years before these boys came west with their family was the when James Miller came west, and William Miller, his 12-year-old son, wrote a diary. And the way they wrote is just beautiful. Their manuscript is beautiful, but telling the stories what it's like with the wagon coming down out of the hills into a meadow and going across a creek and taking wagons apart and trying to find the cows in the morning and doing the laundry and feeding everybody. You know, the kids were always saying, you know, are we there yet? The kids aren't any different. I just think it's a great job what you did. I've got a couple of questions here, it looks like. Let's see. Thank you very much. So Cindy Irish is asking, what was the average mileage per day and how many wagons did they lose per day?
They started with 13 wagons. And again, this is not like a train. People were getting on and getting off all the time. If someone got sick or a wagon broke down, you know, they'd stop for a few hours, maybe half a day. If it was going to take longer than that, they would go on. When they were out in Indian territory, of course, that was a dangerous situation. And so they would wait until another wagon train came up. But that wasn't very long. There were thousands of wagons on the train that year, on the trail that year. And so they would say, you know, met 100 wagons today, you know, met 60 wagons today. They were all over the place, so that the people they started with, they often didn't end up with. People would, if they fell behind, they'd just join another group. As far as the mileage goes, it seems like 20 was a pretty good day, 20 miles. Sometimes they were in just terrible conditions and they were deep sand or in rocks or pushing through the snow up over the Carson Pass. And, you know, they were happy to make 4 miles in a day. 20, I think 22 or 25 was probably the longest. So that the number of wagons in the train, the boys don't say, but I know that they dropped a bunch of wagons. People left the train on foot. Some of them went off on pack horses. Some of them built wheelbarrows and said, they were frustrated by how slow the train was going. And to be able to say, I'm out of here, you know, and they just take off for California on their own. So after a while, they just abandoned some of the wagons because there weren't enough people to man them. Well, one thing I was struck with is there are 75 people, there's only 15 horses. So, you know, I assumed that everybody would have a horse and they'd probably have herds that they would be driving along, but there were just a few people on horses. Most everybody was riding in the wagons or walking. The wagons were hauled by oxen, not horses. And they had herds of cattle. And that was one of their big problems, was that every morning they'd have to go out and round up the cattle, and the Indians were stealing them so that they would, you know, have to stand guard at night. So, you know, some days they would say great weather, beautiful country, things are going great, you know, and other days they were clawing up some rocky hill. There were some hard times on that trail.
No, they didn't have daylight savings then. What I learned from the Miller trip was that they hardly got out of camp before noon every day. So you maybe went only 4, maybe 5 hours on the trip. Horses weren't the animal of choice by any means.
Yeah,
they're more delicate of an animal.
Yeah, this train started early. They were usually off by 6 in the morning.
That sounds impressive. Someone's asking about the death and the hanging, but maybe you want to leave that for the book, huh?
Yeah, you got to buy the book for that one.
And what is the connection to the Boyds? I think we're talking about 2 different Boyd families in San Rafael. The Boyds of the Elks Lodge in Upper Mission, part of San Rafael, is a different Boyd family than this one is, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, it was very confusing because at one point I saw the address where this Boyd family lived, and it was on 5th Street, and I thought it was the Boyd house, you know, which is now the Elks Club. But it turns out,
I have a picture of their house.
They lived like across the street, and as far as I know, are no relation.
It was 5th and C. These Boyds were the legal Boyds, and I think they had homes in Gerstle Park.
Yeah, just to go back to that murder, they were not involved in it. They saw the grave and heard the story. They did not actually see either the murder or the hanging. Just in case.
Someone's asking here, does copying old paper degrade it? Yes.
Yeah.
And is the complete handwritten journal included, or did you need to be selective for the book?
No, it's complete.
That's the whole thing.
Every word they wrote.
The diary entries are very articulate. What education did these boys have? I mean, they were younger than 12.
Yeah, they obviously went to school. They seem to be quite literate. As you say, the handwriting is good. The language is good. They just didn't put periods between sentences and didn't capitalize. So it looks a little run on, but there's not that many words that are misspelled or anything. So I think they were quite well educated. I know they went to school in St. Louis before they left. And then they went to university back in St. Louis. After they got to California, they went back and went to college there, and then went to Harvard for graduate school. So they were well-educated, intelligent young men.
Were you able to learn from any of this? I'm sorry to be asking these questions, but maybe I think of things other people might be thinking of. What compelled them to come west? I know why the Millers did. I'm just wondering if there was any similarities.
We don't know. There's no discussion of it. It's very frustrating. The boys just described their trip. They never once mentioned their mother, although I know she was in the wagon with them. They mentioned their father about 2 or 3 times when he shoots a stagehand or something. But otherwise, they just don't talk about him. They don't talk about other people in the train. They mention meeting other trains, but they don't, say what they learned or who they met. And they don't talk at all about how they got there.
There's so much disease on the river with typhoid and a lot of malaria, which drove a lot of families west. They didn't come here for gold. It was to get out of that place.
Yeah.
There is mention there on how the climb was at Carson Pass. Paul Manald has hiked it, and he thinks it's pretty steep.
It was snowy when they came through. And they say, it's a road you wouldn't believe. So I don't know exactly where they came up. I want to go out and drive there and try to see the route. I just went out to Jackson Hole a couple months ago, and that road is Interstate 80, pretty much follows their route all the way across. So it was fun. I stopped and looked at some of the places that they had gone by.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Any more questions? What's the greatest thing you took away from this, Brian?
The courage and strength of these people,
Yes.
We got it tough. You got no idea what they went through, but you will if you buy the book.
I wish Heather was, maybe Heather, if she had her sound on, I wonder how Heather feels on the success of the book. I don't think we can get her on here.
She can unmute herself.
But she won't know to do that.
We need a sign that says unmute.
Heather.
Hi.
Oh.
I'm here.
Heather, what was your takeaway from the book? What did you feel the best about it?
I think that I just learned a lot about the bookmaking process that I didn't know about before. I mean, there's so much behind the scenes work that goes into producing something like this that I didn't realize. And it took us, a year and a half to do the work that we now get to hold in our hands. And it was a labor of love for everybody involved. We all felt very passionate about the project. And it's just an interesting peek into the lives of people in 1852 and children, and the things that were expected of children and the things that children are capable of doing, dismantling wagons and, all kinds of things.
And the wagons apart. Oh my.
Yeah. And falling off horses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone is
Yesterday we were
asking for
sitting
the
around
book.
the table.
Yeah.
We were talking about this. And then when I read it this morning that that it was taken out of the I want to say strong box, the
Yeah.
box at the bank. I remember when Jocelyn and I got it, and I didn't put two and two together
Yeah.
until today.
Yeah, I mean, these boys were tough. They fall off the wagons, they fall off horses. They're riding. They're not supervised. They're riding horses around. They're collecting food. I mean, it's just very eye-opening just to see the difference on how I have two boys myself. So how boys are raised today, and then the things that these kids went through and their families went through, and just seeking a new life, and the adventure of just being on the trail. So the whole experience was very eye-opening for me, and I'm just really pleased that.
Heather, do you have a copy of the book you could hold up right there?
It's in the other room.
I think Brian has it at the end
Got
of
one
his
here.
presentation, doesn't he?
Just got it. Okay.
There it is.
Okay, there it is.
Very
So-
nice production. Congratulations to Font Hill. It was really great working with you guys, and it looks like a wonderful product.
Yeah, we're very pleased with the product.
Okay, you want to finish up, Brian?
Well, in the Shameless Commerce division, I did write another book about a wagon train coming to California, the Short Brothers, who used to own the land where I live, near Fode Park in San Anselmo. All the houses around here are in the Short Ranch subdivision, and the Short Brothers came out on a wagon train, and they were two boys, a mother, they were teenagers, and two little girls. There was no grown man in their wagon, and they did this same trip. They came over with the Donner Party. So that's an interesting story too. So I actually have two wagon train books.
We have their safe at the museum.
There.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. That's great.
Thanks for coming, all. Don't forget to go to our website, marinhistory.org, for
And
all
then-
kinds of information about the museum and our programs.
Coming up in January will be a talk done by a gentleman who did research on Louise Boyd in one of the exploration ships that she went on, and it's about her relationship with the sea captain, which I will just give a hint at. Apparently, it was not too good. And I want to thank everyone. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.